Good morning, good morning, good morning. How is everybody doing today? All right, it's Viking Day. So, let's get started with it. At the very least, I figure I can get you my Viking presentation. So, the first thing you need to do on Viking Day is to dispel some misunderstandings, to pop some myths, burst some bubbles. And of course, the first one is the fact that the Vikings did not wear horned helmets. Famously, that's a thing that actually Wagner, the opera writer, composer, Wagner, had incorporated into his operas about Vikings because he thought it would make them look more virile and manly. But Vikings didn't actually wear helmets. In fact, when you think about it, it's kind of a dumb thing to have on your head because that's somebody you don't want to give your enemy like something to hold on to, and nobody's like going to try bull charging the enemy with like horns on there. That's not a thing. It's not going to happen. So, that no horns on the helmet. Sorry. The other thing, of course, is that this is a big deal, is that they weren't called the Vikings. I mean, you could, and it would be kind of interesting, I suppose, to have a course on the Vikings, or a lecture on the Vikings, and we're going to talk about Vikings, actual Vikings, in this lecture. But we're actually talking about the Norse people. Viking was a thing that some Norse people did. It's like a verb. You would go a Viking. Rather than and there were other Norse people who we generally think of when we think of the Vikings, but they never went Viking. Viking is basically pirating, raiding, and raiding is one of the big things that the Norse did. But trading is the other thing they did, and then they just farmed. So farming, raiding, and trading. They did all of those things. Viking was just one of the things they did. But that's the one that stuck because, when you do a bunch of pirating and raiding, other people are going to know you for that. I suppose that's a reputation that sticks. So if you wanted something that is a little bit more historically sort of potentially accurate, there's a nice picture from the History Channel show The Vikings. And it's definitely more historically, I'm not going to say it's perfect, but it's more historically accurate than a lot of popular representations of Vikings that have been like massively over... interpreted by, influenced by Wagner, basically, at least in the presentation, and a lot of other sort of myths. So there you go. You want to watch if you're old enough and you want to watch a show that's relatively realistic about the Vikings. The Vikings. All right, so this is a map of the closest we can get to a Viking vampire, a Viking empire. You'll notice they're hanging out here in Greenland. There's a little bit of an arrow here for Vinland and North America. I will be talking about that a little bit later on, actually. You notice people in Iceland. One of the things that's really, really interesting, one of the reasons I love, and I'm not going to pretend I don't, I'm a huge fan. I enjoy studying the Vikings. I mean, I'm not saying they were great people. Some were kind of cool, and there are actually some really positive things to say about the Vikings. But the Norse... So I'm not saying that's not the case, but also there's some pretty terrible stuff about them and that they did. But they're fascinating to me for a lot of reasons. First off, you'll notice that this is a weird, and again, empire's not quite the right word. They don't do, the Norse, until fairly late in the game, don't do government the way we tend to think about other groups doing government. And they don't do empire ever the way we think about other groups doing empires. Because the Vikings had a sea-based empire rather than a land-based empire, at least primarily a sea-based empire rather than primarily a land-based empire. They really make the Norse make their mark on the world stage as traders again, and then later as sort of these pirate ocean-based raiders, not as... So their armies, when they invaded along the coasts and they invaded along rivers. Even this big blob over here in the Rus states, right? There are these big rivers that flow down this way. So they're actually, a lot of that is they're following rivers here. So, and beyond that, you're going to notice that they liked islands and they liked coasts. They don't go inland a whole lot. The Vikings did not spend a whole lot of time invading and building kingdoms, like marching inland to build kingdoms. Instead, they went through. They stuck with coastland so that they could stick with their major mode of transportation, the Viking ships. All right. My favorite way to talk about the Vikings is through talking about Viking names. And we're just going to be taking some snapshots and getting kind of a feel for them and who they are. But something I want you to keep in mind throughout all of this is that the Vikings, they break all the rules, right? Like the way I like to say it is, you just can't keep a Viking in a box, or you can't put a Viking in a box. He'll break out and then hit you with his axe. They break the rules for a number of reasons. It's not It's not random that they break the rules. It's not like, hey, there's just this one group of people, and for whatever reason they don't follow the same rules that most civilizations do. If we go back to the map here, the fact that they are an ocean-based civilization, if you will, which again does not mean that every Norse person was a sailor. Some of them were farmers. There's a lot of Norway and Sweden going on here, you'll notice. And Ireland and England get almost entirely occupied. Like, yeah, they were farmers, but there were a lot of them were seafarers. And as a result, what ends up happening when we analyze the Vikings is that it's a little bit overly simplistic to say that they broke the rules. What's probably more accurate is to say that they split the rules. They followed there were two sets of rules, and they kind of follow between them. There's a sort of set of rules that historians and world history people want to associate generally with nomadic people groups, like most famously the Mongols, but also the Turks would be another example, or even the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula prior to Dar al-Islam and the rest. All right, so you have these groups that are nomadic. They don't live in one place. They tend to move around a whole lot. They don't see themselves as as bound to the land. And they follow, and there are a certain number of common things about those groups, and they tend to follow sets of predictable patterns and rules. Like, you can kind of predict what a civilization like that is going to be like. And then there are what we call sedentary societies and civilizations, and these are these are the civilizations that settle down and they draw up borders for their empire, and then they have an empire, a kingdom, a dukedom, whatever they have, but they have a government with a boundary and the people that live in there, and that's the sort of standard sedentary civilization. And of course, sedentary civilizations get all the love in history. People pay the most attention to them. But in sort of recent-ish times, nomadic civilizations have been getting some interesting attention as well. I mean, the Mongols probably being the most famous example of those, because they are interesting, and Mongols do tend to, nomadic civilizations tend to break the rules of sedentary civilizations. They just have their own rules, though. What's fun to me about the Vikings is the Vikings are sort of half sedentary and half nomadic. They travel a lot more than your standard sedentary, we have our borders civilization. But they do have borders and kingdoms to kind of an extent. They're more creative with their government than a lot of other people of their day. But they have them. And they have their borders, and they will defend their borders to varying extents, but they're happier to move than most are, and they tended to see the world. They were more, to borrow a much later word, they were more sort of cosmopolitan as people. They traveled a lot more, and your average Norse person during this period was far more likely to have encountered people from lots of different cultures and countries than people from those countries were to have encountered each other, beyond their own country. So they fall in the middle, and I'll try to highlight some of the ways they fall in the middle as we go through this. All right, back to the fun names, because I really like telling the story of the Vikings by talking about some of my favorite Viking names. And there's lots and lots of Viking history. It's worth just grabbing Viking sagas, or Icelandic sagas particularly, just reading them. They're fun, and they're kind of histories of clans and clashes and so forth. But I'm not going to do that right now. Let's just talk about some Viking names. The first one is Ragnar Hairy Pants, properly known, if you don't translate his the Hairy Pants, if you don't translate it, it's Ragnar Lothbrok, but Ragnar Hairy Pants. This is what it means. He had these pants made of fur. I think it was bear fur, if I remember the story correctly, that were thought to be not flammable, famously not flammable. I don't know if you rubbed sand in the hair parts, but the hair wasn't off of the pants. So you make pants, but you got the hair still on it, on the outside rather than the inside. So people call them Ragnar Hairy Pants. Ragnar Hairy Pants is often credited with sort of starting the period of Viking expansion, right? Going from just raids, when the Norse go from just kind of periodic raids to actually expanding into all of this. You can kind of see down there. See down this way. Into all of that, right? When they go from just being in Scandinavia, which is, if you will, right here. Right, this is Scandinavia. This area right up here. When they go from Scandinavia to really expanding all the rest. That period of expansion is often credited with to sort of Ragnar Lothbrok, who basically invades Paris. So what he does is he goes a raiding, and he raids all the way down into Paris. And when he gets to Paris, he sort of conquers the city, and the French king offers him a bunch of silver if he'll leave. And he sort of is very amused. He takes it, he leaves, he gets back home, and he basically says, hey, everybody, guess what? If you go and you invade European people's places, and you conquer and you occupy their cities, they pay you for it. Right? Like, because in the Viking mind, right? So, and we get back to that, like, not quite a sedentary civilization, not quite a nomadic civilization, right? In the standard European mind, somebody comes and they takes your city, they take your land, and they're going to keep it forever. They're going to, like, settle into it. They're going to make it into their territory. In the Viking mindset, you go in, you conquer you take some land, you just take all the stuff and you leave, right? So, what Ragnar is super amused by is if you make it, like, if you threaten like you're going to stay for very long, they actually give you more stuff to get you to leave. So this is awesome, and it kicks off this whole period of, like, more and more Norse people moving in and, like, invading and conquering and claiming for various periods of time, and sometimes permanently, right? Sometimes they did end up making the decision, like, no, you know what, actually I think we're better off just living here forever. So there was some, like, permanent conquering. Started under Ragnar Hairy Pants. My next favorite is Harold Mophead, who's actually a really important sort of legendary, maybe real, maybe fictional character in Norse history. In this case, Norwegian. So Harold starts off we meet Harold as this sort of minor king of a minor kingdom in Norway, right? Like, so Norway at that point is divided up into lots of different kingdoms, different, Norse kingdoms, similar culture, similar language, lots of little kingdoms. And Harold wants to, he falls for a girl, a woman who's actually a princess of another neighboring kingdom, named Gytha Eriksdottir. By the way, that you'll notice with Lothbrok as well, this D with a line through it, like it's a T, that's pronounced TH because that's fun. So Gytha Eriksdottir. So he falls for her hard. He just thinks she's amazing, and he proposes concubinage to her. Right? A concubine is a kind of, like, second-class wife. He's already married, so a concubine's like a secondary kind of a wife, which is, maybe not the best deal if you're a princess. And so she basically says no. Like, why would I want to do that? You're not that impressive. I mean, I'm already a princess, and you've got it's a kind of a podunky little kingdom. I think I can do better. And rather than, like, becoming infuriated and, the kind of thing you would get in a lot of other civilizations' stories is, like, he became, he was hurt and infuriated and declared war so he could come in and take the beauty of Gytha for Eriksdottir for his own. That's not a very Norse way. In fact, and this is going to highlight, I'm going to pause right here and say that Norse women had a lot more power than women in a lot of the rest of the world at this point in time, outside of maybe those nomadic societies, right? So there's this weird, and there are different theories about why it's true, but it does seem to be the case that the more sedentary and the longer society has been sedentary, the more patriarchy there is, right? Like, the more you have the rule of men over women, the more women tend to be subjugated. Whereas the closer a society is towards nomadism, on the extreme is actually hunter-gatherer societies, which tend to be almost perfectly, if not perfectly, then pretty close to perfectly egalitarian. That's where men and women are, like, fully equal. They get pretty close. The closest, at least, of any kind of organized societies we know. But then you have nomadic societies, these pastoral nomadic societies, like the Mongols, like the Turks, like the Arabs. Women tend to still have a lot of power and independence in those societies. And then, like, last and worst come the sedentary kingdoms, where you have, women are seen as property of their fathers and their husbands and all the rest of that kind of heinous stuff. The Vikings are between, on this front, the Vikings are going to show up between those pastoral nomads on the one hand and those blanking out here. Oh, and those sedentary societies on the other hand. So Viking women, which is to say that Viking women tended to have a lot more power and independence relative to, and even sometimes like legal protections, relative to the men in their society than a lot of women in other societies at the same time did, especially other sedentary societies. Which meant that when Geetha tells Harold, yeah, no, I'm not interested, he just has to suck it up, right? And in fact, he listened. I'm not going to recommend Harold to you as like a model, as a good role model in all things. But we have to say this for him, like, he was really into this princess. She turns him down, and he says, you know what? She actually has a point, right? Like he takes it to heart. He decides to think about it. He says, you know what? I think she's got a point. Why would marrying me be a benefit to her? Like, why would she want to do that? And so he takes this vow. He's like, I want to become worthy of like Geetha's hand. Like I want her to think that like it would be. I want her to want to marry me or to become my concubine at least. And so he's like, how do I do that? Well, she pointed out that I'm like only the king of this little bitty country. How about, here's what I'm going to do. He then takes a vow. He makes a vow that he will neither cut nor comb his hair until he has conquered all of Norway and unified all of Norway under his rule. And he doesn't, and it takes him like 10 years. And in that time, of course, his hair gets pretty nasty, so he comes to be known as Harold Mophead. But he actually does succeed, and having succeeded, he cuts and combs his hair. Oh, well, first he sort of sends back to Geetha. He's like, hey, look, not so podunk am I now. How about concubinage? Would you like to do that? Remember, she gets to say yes or no. And she's like, yeah, why not? You kind of proved yourself. So he's like really thrilled. He cuts and combs his hair, and she comes and becomes his concubine. And he actually, like, his name gets changed to, if we translate it into English, Harold Awesome Hair, because it turns out his hair was awesome. It's just that once you had to cut it and comb it to find that out. Everybody thought it was like they called him Harold Mophead, but then it was Harold Awesome Hair, and he's like, it's like Fight a Hotter or something in Norse. Fair hair, Harold the Fair Hair. That's how Norway was unified into one king. And their son just had the awesomest name of ever, right? Like their son was named Eric Bloodaxe because Vikings. Next Viking I want to talk about is this guy Ingolfur Arnarsson. Ingolfur Arnarsson is the first leader of, let's call leader of Iceland. Even leader might be too strong. But he's a pretty big deal in Icelandic history. So, how are we going to talk about this? Okay. So, Ingolfur was a kind of a lord, if you will. I mean, he was a leader. Think like a war leader. In Norway, when Harold was doing his like conquer and unite all of Norway thing. And what Harold would do, he'd come and he'd conquer, he'd defeat some king, and then he would offer kind of a deal to all of their war leaders, all of their I'm just gonna like their aristocracy, the lords that were under the king. And the deal basically worked. He was like, okay, like so you can swear allegiance to me. All right, like you had allegiance to that king, but now you've conquered him, so now you can swear allegiance to me as your new king, or you can leave forever, right? Or I can kill you. And a lot of them decided to leave forever because it's kind of, especially in Viking culture, it was pretty shameful to like declare allegiance to somebody who had defeated the last dude you had declared allegiance to, right? Like it's like joining the bad guys. Some of them did, but Ingolfur Arnarsson wasn't one of them. Ingolfur Arnarsson did what I'm sure you would have chosen to do in that situation. He decides to leave. He packs up his family and everybody else into a bunch of ships. He makes sure to take the door frame for his house with him. That's going to be part of the story here in just a second. And sorry, hold on a second here. And he heads off to Iceland, which they kind of knew was there, but nobody had done much with it. So he heads off to Iceland. When he gets to Iceland with like not just his family, but like all of the people that were sort of decided to go with him and be his followers instead of staying around in Norway and be ruled by Harold, who was still a mophead. They just didn't like his hair. Who knows? So when he gets there, he takes he does what, again, I think what you would have done in the situation, right? He takes the doorway of his house, says a prayer to, I think, Thor, and chucks the doorway into that door frame into the water, and then goes to bed. The next minute, they land, like the whole troop lands, and they go looking for the door to see where it washed up on shore. And they find it at this place where there's a bunch of steam coming up out of the ground, because Iceland is like a lot of hot springs. There are a lot of places in Iceland where steam is coming up out of the ground. It's got hot springs all over the place. So they find it this like port in this little like bay cove where there's steam coming out of the ground, and they decide that's where the gods want them to build their city, and they build the city of Reykjavik. Reik being a derivation of like the word reek, which did not mean stink back then. It was like, like vapors coming up. So it's the reeking city, the city that reeks. And that was how Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland today, that was how Reykjavik was founded. It's also how you sort of have the founding of significant Norse settlement on Iceland. And in a lot of ways, Iceland ends up sort of shifting in a lot of historians' minds to being the kind of later focus of Norse and Viking activity. It's like the hub. That might just be because of the records we have, but anyway. Also, the Althingi. I love the Althingi. By the way, this like B that is also a P thing, also pronounced TH. The Althing. Which, by the way, so the Althing is the name for the kind of government, well, the government location and the thing they did there on Iceland. So the Althingi is, what would happen at the Althingi? Let's talk about this. So it was an event. So every so often, from all over Iceland, all of the major heads of family would come, and they would meet together, and they would talk about what Iceland was going to do. They didn't have a leader. They didn't have, like in America, we talk about the executive branch, which is actually kind of helpful, right? The executive branch is the part of government that enforces the laws, right? Like, so the president is the head of the executive branch. Congress is the legislative branch, right? Congress makes the laws. The president makes those laws. He enforces the laws. He makes the laws happen. He carries them out. The Icelanders didn't have an executive branch. They just had and their legislation was the Althingi. They all get together and they would vote on if they wanted new laws. They would have these special people whose job was to have their laws memorized, and those people would sort of recite the laws for a while, and they would all listen. And then they would vote on whether or not they wanted to have new laws, and the most important thing they would do is basically they would do the judicial branch type stuff of government. That's like deciding on court cases and deciding who's guilty. So anybody who had a problem with somebody, with their neighbor, with somebody else in Iceland, would at that point, they would bring their case in front of the Althingi, and they would make their case, like in a courtroom almost. And then everybody would just vote on whether or not the person was guilty. And if the person was guilty, there were basically only two punishments, because again, there's no executive branch. So if you're how do you enforce laws without a group whose job is to enforce laws, like the police, which is who enforces the laws when it needs to be violent here in the United States and in most countries, something police-like. In a lot of places, the police and the military are kind of have been the same thing in the past. That's a break that happens later on. But in Iceland, not so much. They don't have any of that. So how do you enforce the law? Who throws people in jail? Well, they didn't do jail exactly. They just had these two punishments. If you were found guilty, you could get you could get the lighter punishment or the heavier punishment, and they were basically the same thing. It's just how long they lasted, right? Either way, the punishment was outlawry. You would be outlawed. If you were outlawed, it was greater outlawry and lesser outlawry, right? So if you were a lesser outlaw, that just meant you were an outlaw for some period of time, and they could kind of choose based on how bad the thing was that you had been accused of. And if it was greater outlawry, that's forever. Okay. So what does it mean to be an outlaw? Because that might sound kind of cool, and if you've heard the term, you might associate it with Robin Hood or something. Well, an outlaw meant that the law doesn't apply to you, which again might sound like a great thing for a second, right? Law doesn't apply to me, I can steal. But before you go and think about it too far, before you go too far down that path, think about how many laws protect you, right? Nobody is legally allowed to kill you. Right? The reason it would be murder if somebody attacked and killed you is because there is a law that protects you, the law against murder. But if you're not protected by that, somebody can kill you and they haven't broken the law, which is kind of the whole point in terms of Iceland and the Althing. If you were convicted of greater outlawry, you could be killed. You would generally have a certain period of time to basically just leave. It meant you can't live in Iceland, unless you want to and some people did try this, they huddle down in their little territory with their family and never leave the territory, because again, if you leave your territory, anybody who wants to can kill you. they would leave. And if it was lesser outlawry, often what they would do is they would go a Viking. I told you I was going to come back in, right? So they'd go and they'd raid for a while. Spend 2, 3, 4 years raiding Europe, and then come back with their stuff when their outlaw term had ended. And hopefully their family survived all right without them, and now they're bringing a bunch of cool wealth back, and things are even better for them. Or they might go exploring. This is how Greenland gets discovered, right? Eric the Red gets outlawed and heads over to Greenland. And then his son, Leif Erikson, keeps going west and actually finds, well, Canada. Because you remember that the Norse are the first Europeans to ever get to North America. Of course, there are already people there, right? They're Native Americans who were already there. And the Norse interacted with them, and you know what they didn't do? They did not do a genocide against them, which is going to be really relevant a little bit later on in world history when other Europeans get to North America and do a genocide. So, we're going to give the Vikings a little bit of credit for not doing a genocide when they got to North America, because apparently that was a thing that some Europeans would do later on. So I've been talking about Leif Erikson. There's Leif Erikson. Instead, the Vikings get to North America and they hang out for a while and they decide it's not really that big a deal and leave. And that's what happens. Okay, my last favorite Viking name, is a guy named Thangbrand. Thangbrand is the guy who is generally seen as being responsible for converting Iceland from Norse paganism, right? Like Thor and Loki and Odin and Freya and all those fun crowd, the Marvel Comics gods. But they were really the gods that the Norse worshipped. Converting them from that to Catholicism, to Catholic Christianity. And it was Thangbrand that did it. And Iceland converted late. So Norway and Sweden had already converted. Denmark, I believe, had already converted to Christianity when Thangbrand shows up in Iceland. And he was unconventional as far as missionaries go. Right? Like when we picture a missionary, right? A missionary is a person whose job, the thing they do in life is to try to find people who don't share their religion and convince those people to share their religion. And generally in America, when we think about Christians, we tend to think about Christians. When we think about missionaries, we tend to think about fairly pious, kind of peaceful people who go and share the good news, if they're Christians, good news of Jesus, and you should be a Christian too, and here are my reasons why, and all that. That's nice. That was not Thangbrand's MO. Instead, what Thangbrand did is he gets to Iceland, he gets out of his boat, and he goes off and he carves himself this giant crucifix, huge crucifix, this big. And then he attaches some leather straps to the back, and a crucifix, by the way, is a cross with a Jesus carved on, an image of Jesus carved on. And he takes the crucifix and he puts these straps on the back, and he basically starts carrying it around like a giant shield, which is exactly how he uses it. Because then he marches up to the first person he sees wearing a Thor pendant. Because you know how Christians sometimes wear a little cross because when they're Christians. So Vikings would wear a little hammer, a little Mjolnir. In fact, I've got a Mjolnir here, not a Norse pagan, but see, I've got a little Mjolnir on my beard ring here. That's the style they would do too. But they wear on their neck to invoke Thor and say that they were followers of Thor, or you usually had your favorite Norse god that you would follow. You'd be a special devotee of Thor or of Odin or whatever. Odin, I think it was a spear, and so on and so forth. Different gods had different symbols. So he goes off and he finds, but Thor was the warrior god, and there's a reason that Thangbrand picks a Thor person. So he heads off, finds the first person he can who's wearing a Mjolnir necklace, a little Thor. Mjolnir is Thor's hammer, by the way. And he says, your god Thor is this stupid weenie god. Jesus is much more powerful. You should worship Jesus instead of Thor. And the guy is sort of offended, and he's like, no, that's stupid. Thor is a very powerful warrior god, and I'm happy worshiping him. And Thangbrand says, okay, then let's fight, and whoever wins has the more powerful god. And so they do, and Thangbrand wins. And everybody's watching as it sort of goes, oh, well, I guess that's a good point. He just proved that Jesus is a more powerful god than Thor, and they would convert. And this becomes kind of a thing in Iceland where Thangbrand keeps winning these duels and people keep converting. And so the Althing meets, and they basically kind of want to sit down and they want to figure out this thing. And what they decide is they go, well, we don't really care what the religion is, but we want all of Iceland to have the same religion. So we're either going to get rid of the Christians and tell them convert back to paganism or leave, or we'll all convert to Christianity. We just have one or the other. So how do you think they decide to do that? You guessed it. they invite Thangbrand up, and he is invited to duel a Thor person, and they have the duel, and Thangbrand wins, and so everybody at the all thingy goes, well, I guess that makes a good point, and they all converted to Catholic Christianity, and that's how Iceland became Catholic. All right, back to our map. Remember I talked about the fact that the Norse are a kind of a sea-based empire, if you want to think of them as an empire. They're never like unified. There's not one government over all of the Norse. There are a number of different governments. Iceland has its own government. There's no king, right? And remember, if you go back here, that Ingolfur Arnarsson left Norway trying to avoid a king who was trying to become king of all the Norse. And so the Icelanders decide they don't want to do a king, hence the all thingy. They're tired of kings. But they set up kingdoms in England, and the whole thing about the Danelaw, and that's kind of fun. The Denmark kind of is its own kingdom for a lot of the time. Sweden and Norway, kind of a lot of the countries that we associate with as Scandinavian today were at various points their own countries. But they all are shared a similar culture, or similar cultures and similar languages, and I kind of saw each other largely as like, yeah, you're a Norse person too. So it's a sea-based culture or a series of cultures. And of course the key to that is the Norse longship. I mean, technically there were like 2 or 3 different like major types of ship. Like they had one for trade that was like wider and could carry more stuff but not as fast, and they have like the classic longship. Here's a picture of the longship. The longship was sort of the key to the Norse. I'm just going to call all of those the longship. The longship is the key to this Norse sea-based, semi-nomadic, semi-not nomadic empire. And it had a lot of interesting aspects to it. I'm going to highlight some of them here, but not all of them. Before I get to the longship, there's one other technology that the Norse had that I think is just really cool, and that is their navigation technology. We actually don't know how they navigated. They could, if you look on the map here, like they could sail from Norway to Iceland and not get lost, despite the fact that they didn't have compasses, right? Like what we know is they didn't use a compass. They may have had some kind of analog to the compass, something that did a compass thing, but we don't know about it. There's no records, and we haven't found any material evidence. We know that they could do it, and nobody else really could at that point, right? Like the compass will get to Europe like 400 years after the Vikings, from the middle of the Viking period. But until then, Europeans mostly had to sail along the coast. You didn't, like, if your ship got so far away from the coast that you couldn't see the coast anymore, you were in danger of just being permanently lost at sea. Except unless you were a Viking, in which case you could sail all the way across the Atlantic and find Canada. We don't know how, but they could. Also, those were really, really, really seaworthy boats. I mean, to be able to do deep ocean sailing with these things at that point was really impressive. Another really important aspect of these Viking ships, though, was the fact that they were basically symmetrical front to back. I mean, you can see this one that I've got up here. It's got a little dragon-y thing at the prow. But if you look over there, like, the dragon's not going to make a difference in the way the thing sails. And basically, this thing moves equally easily in both directions, at least if you're rowing. I mean, the sail's going to set up to go in one direction. In one direction there. But, minus the wind here, I blanked out, but I'm coming back to you here. Minus the wind, it can go either direction, and if using oars, that's fine. So, what that meant was that these things, especially when it came to raiding, was these things were terrific. You could run them right up on shore, and you could leave you didn't have to turn the boat around or do anything. Like, you just ran back, jumped in, faced the other direction, and started rowing, and boom, you're gone. That's pretty good for lightning raids, because it meant that you could come in, if you were Vikings, you could come in, you could besiege, you could attack the town. You would kill a bunch of people because Vikings killed a bunch of people. Take all their stuff, and then when like the army came to chase you out, you could just leave, and they wouldn't be able to catch you. The other thing has to do with the way they sailed these things. So I really like this story. I heard this from Michael Drought, and he's a professor at Wheaton College. Who talks about the actually how to sail these things. These were actually incredibly difficult to sail, right? Like, it took a lot of training to do it, and that seems to be the reason why other Europeans never really did it. Like, other Europeans would periodically get their hands on Viking ships, Right? Like under the right circumstances, things go right. Occasionally, the Viking raid party would lose a fight, and then you would have like, there's their ship. You can go get it. Do what you want with it. Well, you can't sail it because it took all this training to sail it. So what the Vikings were able to protect, like they kept this ship, this navy technology. It stayed within their civilization, not because other people didn't know how to make the technology, but because they safeguarded the know-how, like the ability to use the technology. The story I heard was the story of these like sort of historians who decided to actually build a Viking longship. Like they remade one, and they took it out and they took it sailing, and it worked great. They had these like professional sailors were doing it, and the way they would steer the thing actually using the wind was they actually these square sails. But if you look at these like cords down here, by like shortening or lengthening or letting out those cords, you can affect the way the wind is going to blow against the sail. Excuse me. And so they could kind of use that to steer. Well, they had all kinds of fun taking it out and sailing around for a while, and they were very impressed by like how fast it went and how well it dealt with waves, and they're doing all these things that historians do when they're interested to figure stuff out. And they got tired, and so what they did was they went and tied those two bottom ropes. They tied those off to like parts of the ship, and so they could take a rest. And almost immediately the whole thing flipped over and capsized, which is likely what would have happened to any Europeans. Unfortunately, all the people who were doing that were rescued. Apparently, if you look look around on the internet long enough, you can find like pictures of like crusty old historians being rescued from the Atlantic after their Viking ship capsized. But you can imagine that's what would have happened to any Europeans who got their hands on one. They didn't have the know-how to actually sail the thing, and it would just sink. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about today are the days of the week, which we get from the Vikings, or the Norse at least. And I just think that's fun. This is one more remnant of them in our, that is, English-speaking people culture. Tuesday is known for Tew or Tyr, so it's Tyr's Day. Wednesday is Odin's Day. Odin is also called Wotan in more the Germany parts of Norse god worshipping cultures. So Wotan Wednesday, Wotan's Day becomes Wednesday. Thursday, of course, is Thor's Day because Thor. Friday is Freya's Day. There's Freya. And then Saturday, Sunday, and Monday are follow a more Roman system. Saturday is Saturn's Day, Sunday is the Sun's Day, and Monday is the Moon's Day, which is copying off of a Latin tradition. All right. All right, so finally, what do we have here? First, keep in mind that the Norse were both traders and raiders. Right? The raiders were the Vikings. Also, the Norse had, and as I said all this at the beginning, but I'm going to kind of reinforce this now, the Norse had aspects of agricultural civilization and aspects of nomadic civilizations. They were maritime, that means sea-based nomads, but they also had agricultural centers, so they did a lot of farming. They had a greater degree of egalitarianism. Remember, that's like equality of genders. Of course, the most famous aspect of that is that they had shield maidens, which are like women warriors. Fun story about that, by the way. So originally, all the theories and legends were that there were these warrior women in Norse culture. But then you had this period where historians thought, that's probably made up. Because there are a number of traditions where where different civilizations had like legends of warrior women, but didn't actually have warrior women. Like they thought it was fun to tell stories, but they actually thought it was freaky weird, and didn't want it to actually be reality in a lot of civilizations. So people started to think that was probably the case with the Vikings as well. And what they would do is they would say, well, we've never found any remains of warrior women. We've never found any graves, and we should, because Vikings were often buried with their stuff. So it was a Norse tradition is that you would bury a person when they died, you would bury them with all of their best stuff. You might also, that was the whole thing with the Viking funeral, you chuck them in a boat and with their stuff in the boat, and then you send them down the river, and then you burn the boat. But more often you would have these big burial mounds where you would, and historians can dig up the mounds. And so they said, so you had a bunch of historians start saying, well, we've never found a mound, we've never found a woman's remains with like weapons and so forth that would suggest that she was a warrior. And people thought, it's a shame, but okay. And so conventional wisdom started shifting away from like the shield maidens being a thing. Well, eventually a woman historian comes along because, thank you, women historian, you bring something to the to the plate that like men historians maybe didn't bring. And a woman historian comes along and she points out, she says, look, how do you know that there were no? You're all going to roll your eyes at this. So she goes. How do you know that we haven't found any remains of women warriors, right? Any female skeletons with warrior stuff, with weapons and things buried with them. And the answer, I'm not making this part up. The answer they gave was they said, well, all of the skeletons we found were buried with weapons. All of the warrior skeletons we found were buried with weapons. And we know that the men are the warriors, so we haven't found any women remains with weapons. And she goes, now let me get this right. You're saying that none of these burial mounds we dug up had women warriors in them. And you know that because the skeletons had weapons. And then you're saying that that is proof that there weren't women warriors. And they're like, well, when you say it that way. So she says, well, now guess what? We have the technology now to analyze the DNA from these bones, and we can check to see whether or not like it's men DNA or typically men DNA or typically women DNA. And so they did. And they said, oh, lo and behold, it turns out that there were women warriors. A bunch of those skeletons were women's skeletons, or at least a number of them were women's skeletons. And they had been buried with, lo and behold, weapons. It's just that everybody had assumed that those were male skeletons because they were buried with weapons. So it was actually that the historians were more sexist than the Vikings that they were studying, and because of that they made the assumption that these skeletons were men's skeletons when they were actually women's skeletons. So, more egalitarian than a lot of the European civilizations, even apparently came quite a while after them. But also Viking women had the right to kind of decide who they wanted to marry. That's not a thing we find very often in Europe. They could get divorced when they wanted to, and it was their choice. They would be like, yeah, I'm tired, I want to get out of divorce. Now, we don't tend to think of divorce as a great thing, but a woman being able to decide for herself if and when she wants a divorce is a pretty significant deal in world history, because often women, in a lot of other societies where women didn't have that ability, they could be stuck in abusive or terrible marriages. And often, and almost always, men can get divorced whenever they want to. It was only women weren't allowed to, right? So a man's like, I don't want to be married to this woman anymore. He could just do that, whereas women couldn't in most societies. But Viking societies are an exception to that. Norse societies are an exception to that. They were also had a much greater diversity of government styles than a lot of other civilizations that we've looked at. And again, their governmenting style was kind of somewhere between. They had a lot of kings, so somewhere there was a sedentary civilization aspect to that. But they also had a very sort of tribal setup with war chieftains and leaders and these band type organizations where warrior bands and other types of bands that would get together and do their thing. So really kind of somewhere between. And then of course there's Iceland, which as on one level you could almost think of as the world's oldest democracy, and Iceland is still a country, right? And was certainly inventive and not the kind of government you find in most of the rest of the world at this point in time, or even later. And then also they're interesting because they were late pagans, right? They stayed pagan much past when a lot of the rest of Europe had shifted over to Christianity. So again, our lesson is you just can't put a Viking in a box. We try to put our Vikings in a box, and we find that no, when you do, they break the box, jump back out, and hit you with an axe. Hope you enjoyed Viking Day. And I hope you have learned something about the Vikings.